So, frustration. Frustration is life's way of telling you you're doing it wrong. So this talk will not feature blood and gore, will not feature intense violence or sexual themes. There will be strong language and there's only use of alcohol. If you guys are going to bring me some, I encourage some single malt whiskey if you don't mind, but if you don't have any, I'll go. So this is me. My name is Evan Light. I'm a freelance code janitor, as I like to say. I also mentor people remotely over the internet. There's me on Twitter. By the way, don't worry about writing, well, this at least, but anything else down. The slides are online on GitHub. I'll give you the link at the end. Stuff I do, I run this crazy thing called Ruby Camp. It's never actually been held in DC. It's going into its 6th year. I'm one of the freelancers in the Ruby Freelancers podcast. Is E. Spencer in this room somewhere hiding? He's not. Oh, shucks. Well, I'm one of the people on the Growing Software Developers podcast. Ash is on it too. We'll be up later. And this is going to be a real talk, or as I like to say, this is a recipe for how to put me out of business. So this is how I want to feel. This is the Dalai Lama. He's generally a pretty relaxed, happy-go-lucky guy. This is how I often feel. Angry, bitter, afraid, unhappy. So how did I get this way? So I worked for the federal government, or contracted with the federal government for a good 12 years and watched them piss your tax dollars away. One project after another getting delivered straight to the shelf, millions of dollars. I've worked as an employee for 2 different startups. The first one, my second day on the job, they failed to make payroll. How about that? And I worked there for 4 months anyway, because I'm a masochist. And then I went to work for myself, so this was even smarter. I've been doing this for 3.5, 4 years now. And I've been doing this for a while, and I've seen a lot of shit. And well, it makes me angry. And as we all know from episode 1, which was just such a wonderful movie, fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, hate leads to suffering, yada, yada, yada. So let's talk about hate. Yeah, that's a good object of hate there. So, we all love to talk about test-driven development, right? I've done this a few different times, a few different conferences, but raise your hand if you TDD. Okay, slightly more modest showing than some other conferences I've been to. On average, most conferences, about half the people raise their hands. I'm here to tell you, you guys don't actually do it. Those of you who raise your hands, any of you guys watch House or House and D when it was on? He likes to say, people lie. You guys don't test. How do I know? Because I keep seeing all these crummy code bases that come my way because I'm a code janitor. They don't have any tests. So there was this wild and crazy guy a few years ago who said, test all the fucking time. So try that. But seriously though, if you're not rating tests and you're making excuses like, well, I'm under the gun and I have to deliver this, sometimes you're right. Occasionally, you have to accept a little bit of technical debt. But technical debt, it's debt. It's something you have to pay back at some point. Write your damn test, please. You do this, you will help put me out of business. Active record callbacks. Ah, yes. Yeah, I love to hate these things. I know they're really tempting to use. At first, they seem like such a great idea. But so let's go look at an example here. So this is something pulled from a discussion I got into online. This is an example of a user class with an after save callback. And we have something else here that's registering itself as a listener to the user class, and then it creates some event. And the event, say the user is having its name changed, and it notifies its listeners, which then sends a message to this client proxy, yada, yada, yada. So AR callbacks, they're just the observers. Observers is in the observer-observable pattern. Sorry, I should have had a link to the observer pattern there. And the observer pattern, according to the C2 wiki, which is a good font of knowledge, I think it was Ward Cunningham's Beast, but it's not all his content. It's something that's supposed to be used for dynamic relationships. And active record callbacks are not really dynamic. I mean, how many of you are defining an active record callback at some other time other than when you're loading your classes? Yeah, that's what I thought. Me too. So there really is no good reason to use these things. Instead, maybe just try to do something simple like this. And by the way, I'm going to say maybe because, like Steve, I have a tendency to speak with really strong language. I don't always say maybe do something like this. I'll often say, do it this way, Dan. And this is a way to do it. I'm not saying this is the only one. But in this example, we have an update method, and it gets a name as a parameter. Actually, I guess it should have been param user's name if you were going to be really anal about your Rails standards there, and you should be. You call save, and then after that, you have this client proxy push change to client event. It's tightly coupled. People like to say tight coupling is bad, but that's a absolutist sort of thing to say, right? Just like you shouldn't be saying always do this, never do that. There's a time and place for everything. Tight coupling, if we don't have tight coupling, then we can never ever make if we're just in plain English, we'd never actually make a point because we'd never actually be able to connect any idea to any other idea. Sometimes you have to connect ideas. To me, this is more meaningful, this is more intent revealing than having this class here and this class here separated by this callback that just magically happens whenever I change the name. So a little bit of tight coupling I think can be a lot more revealing. I highly recommend doing this. So another one that I'm sure you've all seen and committed is either writing a method that has a really long name or it has a really poor name, or both. Or, as I had said up there in the words of Samuel L. Jackson, it's red, green, refactor, motherfucker. So what I'm getting at is you guys don't actually refactor. You probably do what I mentioned earlier when it comes to technical debt with tests. Maybe you write your tests. Maybe you write the simplest, which is often the ugliest possible thing that will make the test pass. But then you never go back to refactor it because I got a deliverable. I have to get this thing out the door. It works right now. I can refactor it later because the tests are there. Well, okay, but let's say you end up writing something like this. You don't really want to try to read this. You can look at the structure. You can see it's really busy. It's really long. There are lots of things going on in there that are ugly. But you can kind of look at just the structure. Just look at the structure. And you can see that there are maybe 3 different ideas at work there. So if we were to take those out, because this is a pretty poorly named method. This is just rectify on the user class. What does that mean? So if we were to look at each one of these ideas and pull them out into a method and name them, oh, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. First thing we want to do is, oh my God, write some tests for it if we don't have any, which we probably don't. And this is actually a little bit based on some ideas from Michael Feathers working with Legacy Codebook. Great book. Yes, it's in Java. Get over it. It won't hurt you. It's not hard to read. But what Mike suggests and what I tend to do is I will stub out the dependencies in any particular method I'm trying to test, because often a method like the one here, it's got a lot of stuff going on. There can be a lot of dependencies, a lot of different objects involved. And that makes testing it kind of difficult. So you want to isolate those dependencies. So stub them out, test all the logical branches, test the boundary conditions, make your test pass, and then you can actually go on and then you can clean it up. Because if you try to refactor it, assuming it's even working, before you have a test, you're just as likely to break it. And then let's talk a little bit about individual refactorings we could do. This is just a little bit out of Michael Feathers again. It's Martin Fowler's refactorings book. These are really some of the simplest refactoring recipes, if you will, or steps that he defines. So this one, we're just doing an extract method. We're taking these 3 different ideas and we're extracting them out, and we just give them simple names that seem to define what each block is doing. So here we have process pending payments, notifying collections about overdue bills, and sending my remaining bills. Now, one thing I want you to get out of this is notice that each one of those names, because I was shooting for a meaningful name for each little block of code, these names have nouns and they have verbs. This is kind of important. So let's go look at just this notify collections about overdue bills, just to focus on one little piece. Let's elide the other ones for now. So if we were to try to clean this up, maybe the next thing we would do, okay, I already mentioned the rename method, and focus in there. So we can take this submit to collections idea, and we can extract this into a collection claim class, where we file a claim, and we file against a claim. File a claim against a bill. There we go. I guess maybe you could do that the other way, say bill file against, or bill file claim. In this case, I said collection claim file against bill. So we put that in. Now we have collection claim file against bill, which is a little more semantic. Then next thing, we do a few more extract methods. So then we take out the loop and we put that in past due bills. And then we take out the conditional and put that in past due as a predicate. And now we have something that reads a bit better. So the next step for the reader would be, should the user even know how to rectify his account? You have a verb and a noun there. So your hint here is that the noun could be a class, an account class, and maybe the account should know how to rectify, and the user should be delegating to it. Just small steps. Just as long as your tests keep passing, if you have the tests there, small steps will get you there. So try to take a little time to stop and refactor. Once you have your stuff working, really it won't kill you. It'll make your life better later. Even if you're in a rush, you can usually afford at least a little. So the typical user class, this is usually a point of pain for me too. And when I thought of this, I thought of my mother-in-law. My mother-in-law does not know how to mind her own business. And by the way, when I was writing this presentation, I was lying in bed and my mother-in-law was in the house and I was feeling invaded and uncomfortable, and I thought, you know, I'm going to channel that frustration and anger in this presentation to be nice and cathartic. So yeah, I get to mention my mother-in-law. So this user class, here, we've got all this nasty code. Well, it doesn't look nasty, right? This actually looks kind of clean. We're mixing in all these different modules. So this looks nice and organized, right? This is really pretty terrible because we've taken all this complexity, all this behavior out of the user class, and we're just pushing the logic around. We push it into all these different individual modules. So it looks like the user class isn't necessarily doing that much, or at least it could deceive you into thinking that. But the footprint for the user class is still going to be ginormous. If you were to call methods on it, it would be huge. And then one of the other fun things you can encounter, and I've seen this before, mixing in a lot of different modules, is what about possible dependencies between the modules? Because one tendency I've seen when you're just pulling logic out and shoving them in modules, if you don't do any refactoring, it's quite possible that you're going to pull out some behavior and put into one module. It's actually going to depend on another module. Now maybe you have to include module X if you're going to use module Y, or maybe even worse, maybe you have some kind of ordering dependency. Not a good idea. This just hides the complexity. So this is how I feel when I see that. So what I suggest to do, instead of writing all these mix-ins, is at least for this example, and what I've dabbled with, is I just write where I get a lackey, a delegate, or really what I'm going to mention over here is it's really just a decorator pattern. And this is just using simple delegator with method missing to just have a little bit of access control, a little bit of permission logic. And if this permission logic doesn't run into any problems, just call super. So we just keep going. So it can just wrap, this will wrap basically anything because user with normal permissions doesn't really know anything. And it's just going to play nicely with simple delegator. So we would use it something like this. We would just wrap a user object we get back. And we try to call a method on it. And if we're not allowed to process it, then we're going to get an exception. So let's talk about templating, because as we probably know, most templates suck, or templating still sucks. So this is a really simple example. I guess I should have, this is a contrived one. I couldn't use client code. But I've seen some pretty icky templates for my clients. So putting logic in your template, generally a no-no. I'm sure a lot of you know. So one thing you could do is you could use helpers, but then you end up with some kind of, you might end up with a nasty mess. Well, this isn't that bad, actually. You extract the logic and do one single method. You have all the branching in the helper. Yeah, okay. But helpers are also kind of poor objects. This is, if we just had this one behavior, maybe that's not so bad, but let's pretend you have your typical bloated helper that has a lot of logic, so you want to extract all the stuff in the different methods. And now you have this junk drawer. Because I mean, helpers are basically, if you've been a Java programmer, they're like your utils class in Java. Yeah, okay, I hear someone once again came over there. It's the island of misfit toys for methods in your front end. So what I like to do, instead of having something like this actually came from client code, and this is a kind of small one, but is what if you actually just use plain old Ruby objects, basically? What if you use something like what we call a presenter? So a presenter can just be a plain old Ruby object. It just has, or plain old object, just a state, and it has some methods on it. It's really advanced stuff. So we can take that logic out of the helper, and wait a minute. Right, we still have to choose a presenter. So I don't really, right, so, okay, so this is not a great example, really. I take it back. It's been a little bit since I looked at this one slide. So each one of these classes is handling one of the conditions that we had before. And then we just have to choose which one of these presenters we want to use. So you might notice that this doesn't really look any less complex than the helper example. And that should tell you something. Maybe we don't always want to go to using presenters. I mean, they can be a handy technique, but they don't always apply. So kind of a rule of thumb is, for me, is whenever I have maybe 3 or more methods that I need from a template and that I want to extract, then maybe I'll go to a presenter. Or if I need state in order to, if I need some kind of state other than maybe just the model, or maybe, yeah, I don't know. I'm rambling here just a little bit, but Anytime state comes into it, anytime I need 2 or 3 or more methods, or frankly, if it just starts to feel, and I'm going to talk more about feeling here, if it starts to feel complex, I would just start to extract it into another class, just to let you focus on it, on that little bit of complexity. Plus, the nice thing about extracting it into a presenter is it's just a plain old Ruby object. It's easy to test. I mean, okay, with a module you can mix it in, but with presenters, a class, instantiating, it's easy. I already talked about the choose. So trying presenters, I wrote a very simple gem called Modest Presenter. Modest because it really is pretty stupid and simple. Draper's a more popular one. Steve Klapnick maintains it these days. He's around here somewhere. It's a similar idea. It's a somewhat different philosophy. His focus is more on the decorator pattern. I do a little bit more magic, if you will, so maybe you don't want that. But it makes my life easier. Monkey patching. You don't want a monkey patch, really, because you end up with a situation like this. You probably can't read all this, nor should you, but just focus on this one little part. This was in Rescue. Ironically, Steve also maintains this because he does everything. He maintains this now. I ran into this before Steve touched Rescue. So in Rescue, you have the ability to add hooks that will get called, I don't even remember exactly the timing, because this was something I ran into a year or two ago.
All the time.
All the time, okay. Yeah. And, well, someone monkey patched Rescue so that my hook wouldn't get called, but I didn't know that. I thought my hook was going to get called. I thought it was getting called. And I spent the next 4 hours chasing my tail until I found this. So, and this is because one gem monkey patched another gem. So instead what I recommend is just plain old dependency injection. And an example of that would just be if I were to have forked Rescue back then, which I didn't, because Rescue didn't seem like it was being actively maintained at the time. Again, thanks, Steve. We're doing it now.
I've already coordinated with that committer to improve their monkey patching on that class.
Thank you. I don't think I'll see this one again because that gem's not getting used so much anymore, if you're familiar. Yeah.
Yes, it happens.
But this would have been a really simple solution, is just let me inject my own hooks and actually track the hooks internally. But there wasn't any API exposed for it, so instead of exposing an API, this guy just monkey patched it. So better to actually participate in open source than just go monkey patch, because you're going to make someone else's life painful later. And this is just how it could work. So log the meter. You've probably heard this one before. You can play with your friends, you can play with your privates. You shouldn't play with your friends' privates. Sorry, that's as close to a sexual reference as we get in this. Hopefully no one has a problem with that. But in a nutshell, just you don't want to, this talks to tight coupling to an extent. You don't want to tightly couple more than one call away, basically, one layer away. So if you have a user that has subscriptions, that has magazines, don't go user subscription magazine. Go just deal with the subscriptions, for example. Otherwise, you're adding more dependencies, which makes your life more complex. Style. If you write code like this, I'm going to come hurt you. It kind of says that, but it runs off the page because it's so damn long. I see lots of code like this. I don't know why people like horizontal code. I really don't. Vertical code, scientifically proven. Vertical text, because we know a little bit about publishing. We've been printing things for ages, right? Vertical text is easier to read than horizontal text. So you could just, oh my God, use carriage returns. It won't kill you, really. Have just a few more lines. If you have some kind of really strict rule at your company, it says your methods won't be more than 5 lines, and that means adding extra carriage returns would break it when you need to hit someone. Don't quote me on that. So not considering your audience. I'm trying to consider you guys here. But when you're writing, all right, so here's an example. A little bit of nerd rage for you. But seriously, though, if you're writing a bit of complex code, because sometimes we all deal with problems, we are confronted with something which pushes the limits of our ability, of our knowledge. And we have to write something ugly because we don't know how to say it concisely. At least have the decency to pull it out and put it someplace all by itself and hide it from people, at least just a little bit. Because otherwise, if I'm just tooling around, working in, say, the user class, and I come upon some gigantic ugly thing in the user class, I'm probably going to freak out a little bit. But if you just hide it behind some class or put it in a module, make it a module level method or something like that, you've made my life a little simpler. So you don't want to be one of these guys. You want to be a hero in private, is what I like to say. So solve your really nasty problem, but do it behind closed doors. Don't make it so everyone else has to deal with it. you have different levels of skill in your team. If you're working at your highest skill level, and say you're the most experienced coder in the team, the odds are the other people in your team are not going to be able to figure this clever code out. Clever should be a, of course I can't think of it right now, but clever should be a bad word in your vocabulary. Breaking convention. So, C3PO with his head on backwards. So conventions, what conventions? So we have a controller here in Rails, and none of the methods are REST-like. So if you were to look at that, that would probably make your life a little bit more confusing. You would actually have to go look at the methods and make sure that they actually render the templates you would expect. If you were to see that, you were going to think, okay, nothing else in here is going to adhere to conventions. So you can't predict things. The point is, predictable and boring is good. You know, people who say that, yes, we're craftsmen, it's part art, part science, but science is repeatable. And predictability helps make code repeatable, it makes it understandable. You can say it makes us commoditizable by degrees. Yeah, maybe that's true, but we want to be efficient as developers, not wasteful. And looking at this is going to make it harder for me to do my job than looking at this. And I've seen a lot of this. If you see match in your routes file, that's a smell. Or I guess now it's if you see get, put, post, delete, patch, all that, you really want to see resources. If you don't, you see something else, you should be asking why. Vocabulary, get one. If you are going to define a class by taking, in the German fashion of taking a bunch of words and mashing them together, you're probably doing it wrong. So you could say user team, you could say candidate, employer, job. Yeah, these are actually class names from projects I've worked on. Or you could say something like team membership, or you could say something like maybe applicant or job applicant. You know, these are actually more meaningful. Candidate, employer, job is kind of a mouthful. So I mean, let's think about this. As long as you have a little bit of an English vocabulary, it's not that much of a stretch to get from candidate, employer, job to applicant. You just need to pause for a moment and say, I think that's a little bit too long. Like if you have more than 2 capital letters in your class name, that's probably an indicator you want to change something. Maybe even 2 should be a hint. I mean, team membership, that's not bad. But I mean, user team, yeah, team membership, maybe you could do better than team membership. So enough with code. Let's, because here I'm talking about all these different things that I've seen my customers do that I've done that have frustrated me. So let's talk about career and life. In my career, I'm sure in a lot of your careers, at the very beginning, it's exciting. You're learning new things. You're failing a lot and learning lessons. And it's all lightsabers and blasters and the Force and all that good stuff. And then you learn about midichlorians. You see episode 1. And then you're just left with this. You know, suddenly you're promoted into management, and you're just doing maintenance code in this project that has no tests at all, like I do sometimes. And you have to write, well, writing tests isn't necessarily bad, but you're doing lots of painful stuff. And really what you should be doing is you should be stretching out with your feelings, as Obi-Wan said. You should be asking yourself, what's wrong here? Because if you're suffering, if you're feeling frustration, again, it's life's way of telling you you're doing something wrong. This is just as true with coding as it is with anything else. It's just with test-driven development. I hope you're a lot more sensitive to that in your code, but you can carry that beyond just your code. The Dalai Lama might call it mindfulness practice. Carrie kind of hinted at that without saying it earlier in her presentation. So what I'm getting at is that we like to argue about these things we believe strongly, and Steve brought up a couple. Hi. There we go. Ooh, that's loud. So Steve brought up a couple of sensitive events that occurred in the Ruby community. And let me fix that. There we go. So we like to argue about these things that we believe in, but how important are they really in the grand scheme of things? You might not believe it, but that's actually me on the right about, I don't know, more like 7, 8 years ago. And that's my wife on the left. I was, actually I wasn't really happy in that picture, but you can't tell. My wife had been diagnosed with Huntington's disease, which is a neurological, progressive, systemic disease with no cure. That's to say that it tears your brain apart slowly from the inside out. It takes away everything from you a little bit at a time. And there's nothing we can do to stop it. We can just maybe slow it down a little. We can treat the symptoms a little. And we'd only gotten the diagnosis, I guess maybe it was a year or 2 ago. So at that point, I was still a government contractor. I was pretty miserable with that. My wife and I had been together, we weren't married then, we'd been together for 6 months. And then we got to diagnosis. And my life went straight to hell. I mean, I hated life. Going to Hawaii, like we are in this photo here, was a bit of a stretch for me, but I was trying to be happy. And I didn't really start to pull out of that depression. This was 4 years maybe, till 2007. There was a conference I went to called Ruby Fringe. I don't know if anyone here was there. I'm realizing I'm starting to get a little bit old as Ruby community goes. Gray hairs might attest. And there was this presentation by this fellow named Damien Katz, who maybe some of you have heard of, the guy who invented CouchDB. And his talk was called CouchDB and Me. But really, his talk was about how, well, in a nutshell, his life went to hell. He was working on this CouchDB thing. He had, in his spare time, he had a 9-to-5 job. And he got laid off. And he couldn't find a job, and he had a wife and kids, I think, at the time. He had to sell his house, he had to sell his car. I don't remember if he used the exact words, but it was kind of like, a country song, where he just, lost everything progressively. But then he kept doing what he loved. He kept working on CouchDB. And eventually, IBM came along and said, hey, we'll pay you to work on that. So he went to work for IBM. And now he has his own company where, as far as I know, he's prospering, and he's still working on CouchDB. So for me, I better not step back too far, that was a huge inspiration, because here's this guy who lost, well, he didn't lose everything, but he lost a lot, and he lost his pride and his belief in himself. But he stuck with what he loved. He kept meeting with his family, he kept working on a problem that he believed in. It was something that he was passionate about. And eventually it came back to him. And here I was in 2007. I loved Ruby. I was working in Java. I was working for the federal government, absolutely miserable, working in Java, so I was kind of miserable. My wife was diagnosed with a terminal disease. I was living next door to my parents because they wanted to help. My parents tried so very hard to help. They're really great people, but they were too protective, so I felt like a big child. So all these different things pushing me down. And listening to Damien's talk, I realized maybe if I stick with what I love, because I really love Ruby. Ruby made programming fun for me again. I almost went and became a manager. If I stuck with Ruby, if I invested myself in Ruby, then maybe it would pay back, maybe it would come back to me. So I went to conferences, I started going to conferences, I talked to people. And so I quit my job, and as a cushy government contracting job, they pay really well, you don't have to work that hard. I like to, but most other people didn't, so I didn't fit in. And I took basically a 50% pay cut to go work at a startup, the second one I mentioned. It didn't matter. I was happy. Granted, we moved someplace cheaper. We live out in bumfuck Egypt, excuse me, out in Maryland. The house is cheaper, but it's a nicer place. We're close to my mother-in-law, who I mentioned is not knowing how to mind her own business, but she's helpful and she cares about her daughter. She might make me unhappy sometimes, but she cares about my wife, and so she's good that way, for sure. So my point is that if you follow what you love, and I mentioned this to you as kind of my way of paying it forward to Damien, because his talk just did so much for me. If you follow what you love, no matter how unhappy you may be, it's probably going to at some point come back to you. I'm not saying you want to risk life and limb to do it, but maybe you do, because what's the point of a life where you're just absolutely miserable? I mean, we work our jobs. If you're a contractor, maybe 30 hours a week. If you're a full-timer, maybe 40, 50, 60 hours a week. What's the point in spending all your time doing something you don't care about? So what I challenge you to do is, if you're in this audience and you're sitting here and you're not happy with your lot in life, and you know there's something you care about, something you care about more that you're not following, what I'll ask you is, why don't you just take a risk on yourself? You can live with less. If it means earning less money, there are plenty of studies that say you earn $75,000 or more in the United States a year, and you're going to be just as happy or about as happy as if you earned several million. Your happiness isn't really determined by the amount of money you have. It's really determined by the relationships you have and by doing things that you care about. So if there's something you're denying yourself that you care about, then take a risk on yourself and pursue it. That's it. So keep flying, stay shiny.